Sometimes life puts us on paths of humiliation to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that imposing house in Chattanooga, I was invisible to everyone except for the truth that would eventually set us all free. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Dorothy, but everyone calls me Dottie. Today I'm 84 years old and my heart is full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's such a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I discovered a family secret that had been hidden for 30 years, and how this revelation transformed a relationship that began with tears and blood and ended with the deepest love I've ever known. This story begins on a sweltering summer night in 1959, when I was just 17 years old, lying in a bed stained with blood that wasn't mine, wondering if my life was already over before it had truly begun. I remember that wedding night like it was yesterday, every detail etched into my memory with painful clarity. There I was, trembling in my white cotton nightgown that my mother had sewn for me, waiting for my new husband, Samuel, in the small bedroom of his parents' house on Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. We'd been married that very afternoon in the small Baptist church on Market Street, and I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The wedding dress had been my grandmother's, altered to fit my small frame, and the whole ceremony felt like a dream that I might wake up from at any moment. When Sam finally came to bed, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the doorknob. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his dark hair, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening breeze coming through the window. "Dorothy," he whispered, and his voice cracked like a boy's. "I don't know if I know how to be a husband." Before I could respond, his nose started bleeding profusely, drops of bright red blood spattering across my pristine nightgown and the white sheets his mother had put on the bed, especially for our wedding night. I woke up the next morning thinking the worst had happened, but it was just my poor husband's nerves getting the better of him. That morning, as I tried to wash the blood from my nightgown in the small basin by the window, scrubbing with the harsh lye soap until my knuckles were raw, I heard his mother Ruth's voice echoing through the hallway like a command from on high. "Dorothy, breakfast is ready, and we need to discuss the household rules." Even then, looking at my reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, I knew my childhood was officially over, and my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. Ruth Eleanor Hutchinson was a woman of 52, a widow who had raised Sam alone after his father, Harold, passed away when Sam was just 12 years old. She was tall and imposing, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She ran that house at 1247 Scenic Highway with an iron fist, and every piece of furniture, every plate, every spoon, every doily had its designated place that had remained unchanged for decades. That first morning, she sat me down at the large oak kitchen table that dominated the room and explained in precise detail how things worked in her domain. "You'll help with the cooking," she said, pouring coffee from a pot that had seen better days. "But I'll do the meal planning and all the shopping. You'll clean the upstairs bedrooms and bathroom, but I'll handle the downstairs parlor and my own quarters. You'll do the washing on Mondays and the ironing on Tuesdays." She paused, fixing me with those steel gray eyes that seemed to bore right into my soul. "And Dorothy," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow sounded more threatening than shouting, "you'll ask permission before you change anything in this house. Anything at all. This is still my home, and it will remain my home until the day I die." I nodded, swallowing my pride along with the bitter coffee that tasted like it had been made with yesterday's grounds. I was 17 years old, scared out of my mind, and completely dependent on these people who were now supposed to be my family. My own mother lived clear across town, And with no telephone and no way to get there except by walking, I felt more alone than I ever had in my entire life. The first month of marriage was a series of small humiliations that chipped away at my confidence, like water wearing down stone. When I tried to rearrange the furniture in our bedroom to make it feel more like a home Sam and I shared together, Ruth made me put everything back exactly where it had been for the past 20 years. "This room has been arranged this way since Samuel was a boy," she said coldly, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "His father Harold arranged it just so, and there's no reason to change it now, just because you have some fancy ideas about decorating." When I attempted to cook a special Sunday dinner for Sam, using my mother's treasured recipe for chicken and dumplings, the one dish I knew I could make perfectly, Ruth took one small bite and pushed the entire plate away with a look of disgust. "This isn't how we prepare chicken in this house," she announced loudly in front of Sam and his Uncle Robert, who was visiting from Nashville. "Dorothy, you'll need to learn our ways if you're going to be cooking in my kitchen." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as I watched Sam avoid my eyes, too intimidated by his mother to defend his new wife. Uncle Robert tried to lighten the mood by complimenting the biscuits, but the damage was done. That night, I cried myself to sleep while Sam pretended to be already asleep beside me. I was learning that keeping peace in this house meant keeping my mouth shut, my opinions to myself, and my dreams locked away in my heart where they couldn't cause any trouble. Everything changed dramatically when I discovered I was pregnant just 4 months after our wedding day. I had been feeling sick in the mornings, throwing up my breakfast almost every day, and when I finally worked up the courage to tell Ruth about my symptoms, she immediately took complete control of the entire situation. "You're carrying a baby," she announced, as if she were declaring the weather. "And now you'll do exactly as I say, if you want that child to survive." She prescribed bitter herbal teas that made me gag, and established strict rules about what I could and couldn't eat, when I could rest, and how much activity was acceptable. "You'll drink this nettle tea every morning," she commanded, handing me a cup of the most awful-tasting liquid I'd ever encountered. "My mother gave it to me when I was carrying Samuel, and it'll make sure you have a strong, healthy baby." She monitored everything I ate with the precision of a military commander, watching every bite that went into my mouth and questioning every craving I had. She made me walk exactly 1 mile every afternoon, no more and no less, timing me with her father's old pocket watch. She controlled when I went to bed, when I woke up, and even how long I could spend in the bathroom. I felt like a prisoner in my own pregnancy, trapped in a body that was no longer my own, and in a house where I had no voice. But during those long, difficult months, I began to notice something strange and oddly comforting. When I talked to other young wives in the neighborhood during my prescribed daily walks, they all had remarkably similar stories about their mothers-in-law. Mrs. Patterson from down the street told me about her mother-in-law, who made her scrub the floors on her hands and knees, even when she was 8 months pregnant. Mrs. Coleman from the church said her mother-in-law had thrown away all her personal belongings and replaced them with items she considered more appropriate. It seemed like every woman in Chattanooga had a Ruth controlling their lives, and somehow knowing I wasn't alone made the burden a little easier to bear. When Sam lost his job at Henderson's carpentry shop due to a downturn in construction, we became even more dependent on Ruth's generosity, and she never let us forget it for even a single day. "You're lucky to have a roof over your heads and food on the table," she'd remind us at least once a week, usually during dinner when we were all gathered around the table. There are plenty of young couples sleeping in their automobiles because they can't afford rent. But despite her constant reminders of our precarious situation, Sam and I started secretly hiding small amounts of money under our mattress whenever we could manage it. $1 here when Sam did odd jobs for neighbors, 50 cents there when I sold eggs from Ruth's chickens to ladies from church, quarters I saved from the grocery money by buying cheaper cuts of meat. We dreamed of having our own place, our own rules, our own life where we could make decisions without asking permission. The tension in the house was suffocating, especially after Sam's brother-in-law, Henry, moved away to Memphis with his wife and children, leaving us as the only other adults in Ruth's domain. Every day felt like walking on eggshells, wondering what innocent action might set her off next. I learned to anticipate her moods, to read the signs in her face and voice that warned of an approaching storm. When she pursed her lips in a certain way, I knew to make myself scarce. When she started clattering pots and pans louder than necessary, I knew someone was about to get a lecture. And when she called me by my full name instead of just Dorothy, I knew I was in serious trouble. The birth of our first child, little William Harold, named after both our fathers, was the moment I first saw Sam find the courage to stand up to his mother. Ruth had been insisting for months that we name the baby Harold if it was a boy, after Sam's deceased father. But Sam and I had decided together that we wanted to honor both our fathers by using both names. When the midwife placed that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, Ruth immediately started discussing the christening arrangements and referring to the baby as Little Harold. That's when Sam, who had been quietly supportive but never confrontational, stood up from the chair beside our bed and said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, "Mother, Dorothy and I have chosen the name William Harold. That's what we're calling our son, and that's what he'll be called in this house." I had never heard him speak to her with such authority, and for a moment that seemed to last forever. I thought Ruth might explode with rage. Instead, she turned pale as a sheet and left the room without saying a single word. Later that night, she was even more controlling than usual, as if she needed to regain the power she'd lost in that moment of public defiance. But I had seen something in my husband that day that I didn't know existed, a strength and determination that gave me hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could build a real life together if he could find that courage more often. When William was 2 years old and toddling around the house, getting into everything, Sam surprised me by announcing that he'd been secretly saving money and had finally accumulated enough for us to rent a small house across town. "I found a place on Pine Street," he said quietly one evening after Ruth had gone to bed. "It's not much, but it's ours." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Freedom at last. The house was tiny, just 3 rooms and a small kitchen, but it might as well have been a palace as far as I was concerned. Moving into our own place was like taking my first real breath in years. I could arrange the furniture however I wanted, paint the walls any color I chose, and cook whatever pleased our family. I could make decisions about my own home, my own life, my own family. But freedom came with its own set of challenges that I hadn't anticipated. I quickly realized that Ruth had never actually taught me how to manage a household budget, how to plan meals for an entire week, or how to handle the practical aspects of running a home independently. She had controlled everything so completely that I had to learn everything from scratch, often making costly mistakes that stretched our already tight budget. I bought too much food and watched it spoil, or bought too little and had to send Sam to the store multiple times. I didn't know how to negotiate with vendors or how to recognize when shopkeepers were taking advantage of a young, inexperienced housewife. But despite the challenges, every mistake was a lesson in independence, and every small success felt like a victory. I decided to start a small sewing business from our home to help make ends meet and give us a little financial cushion. Sam was reluctant at first. He thought it reflected poorly on him as a provider, and worried that people would think he couldn't support his family properly. But when I showed him how much money I could make just by hemming pants for the men in our neighborhood and altering dresses for the ladies at church, he agreed to let me try. I set up my sewing machine in the corner of our small living room and put out word that I was available for alterations and simple sewing projects. My first big order was a wedding dress for a young woman named Patricia, whose mother had heard about my work through the church grapevine. She wanted something elaborate, but couldn't afford to go to the fancy dress shop downtown. I worked on that dress for 3 weeks, staying up late into the night to hand-sew delicate lace appliques and tiny pearl buttons. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever created, and I was so proud of the workmanship. The night before the wedding, disaster struck. My sewing machine broke down completely, just as I was finishing the final hem. I spent the entire night hand-sewing the remaining details, my fingers bleeding from the needle pricks, my eyes burning from the strain of working by lamplight. When I delivered that dress and saw Patricia's face light up with joy, when I saw how beautiful she looked on her wedding day, I knew I had found my calling. This was something that belonged to me, something Ruth couldn't control or take away. 3 years after we moved into our own house, Harold became gravely ill with what the doctor called consumption. Despite our complicated relationship with Ruth, Sam and I knew we needed to help care for him during his final months. We took turns staying at the hospital during his treatments and later at the house when he became too weak to leave his bed. During those long, quiet nights of keeping vigil, something unexpected and beautiful happened. Ruth and I began to talk, really talk, for the first time since I'd known her. She told me about her fears for Sam's future, her loneliness as a widow, her struggles raising a boy without a father's guidance. She shared stories about her own mother, who had been even more controlling than Ruth, and about the dreams she'd had as a young woman that she'd set aside to focus on her family. I saw a vulnerability in her that I'd never noticed before, a pain that ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. When Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold February morning, Ruth was completely lost. She had been his caregiver for so long, had structured her entire existence around his needs, that she didn't know how to exist without that consuming purpose. Without hesitation, I offered for her to come live with us. Sam was surprised by my invitation, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Ruth had been difficult, even cruel at times, but she was family, and I had learned that family takes care of each other even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you something precious. Having Ruth in our home was certainly an adjustment, but it was different this time in ways I couldn't have predicted. She wasn't the commanding matriarch anymore. She was a grieving widow who needed our support and understanding. She helped with William, sharing stories about Sam's childhood that made us all laugh until our sides hurt. She taught me old family recipes that had been passed down through generations, sharing secrets about cooking that I'd never learned from anyone else. She showed me how to preserve vegetables for the winter, how to make soap from scratch, and how to stretch $1 further than I'd ever imagined possible. Slowly, carefully, we developed a partnership based on mutual respect, rather than control and submission. One evening, about a year after Harold's death, Ruth couldn't sleep. She came to the kitchen where I was mending clothes by the light of the oil lamp and sat down across from me at the small wooden table Sam had built with his own hands. "Dorothy," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you about Sam. Something I should have told you long ago, but I was too scared, too ashamed, too afraid of what you might think." I set down my sewing and looked at her expectantly, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything I thought I knew about my husband and his family. "Sam had a twin brother," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking like glass. "Samuel and Simon. They were born just 2 minutes apart, identical in every single way. Both of them had the same dark hair, the same blue eyes, the same little dimple in their left cheek. But Simon was weak from birth, smaller than Samuel, and he had trouble breathing from the very beginning." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes with her worn handkerchief. "When they were 3 months old, Simon caught pneumonia. The doctor said there was nothing he could do, that we just had to wait and pray. I sat up with that baby for 5 straight days and nights, holding him, trying to keep him warm. begging God to let him live. But Simon died in my arms on a Sunday morning while Samuel slept peacefully in the cradle beside us. I felt the world shift around me as if the ground had moved beneath my feet. A twin brother? All these years, and I'd never known that my husband had come into the world as part of a pair. I buried that baby with part of my heart, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I couldn't bear the thought of losing Sam too. Every cough, every fever, every time he climbed a tree, or rode his bicycle, or ran too fast, I was terrified I'd lose him the way I lost Simon. I know I was too protective, too controlling, too afraid to let him live his own life. But I couldn't survive losing another child. Tears were streaming down both our faces as the weight of 30 years of hidden grief filled the small kitchen. Suddenly, so many things made perfect sense. Ruth's overprotectiveness, Sam's strange dreams he'd sometimes mentioned, the way Ruth occasionally called him by a different name when she was tired or distracted. The next morning, I told Sam what his mother had revealed in our midnight conversation. He was quiet for a long time, sitting on the edge of our bed and staring out the window at the morning sun filtering through the trees. I could see him processing this information about a brother he'd never known existed, a part of himself that had been lost before he was old enough to remember. "I've always felt like something was missing," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Like I was supposed to be part of a pair, like there was someone else who should have been walking through life beside me. I used to dream about a boy who looked exactly like me, who knew all my thoughts before I spoke them. But I thought it was just my imagination, just childish fantasies that I'd outgrow. That conversation brought Sam and me closer than we'd ever been in our years of marriage. We talked about identity, about the invisible connections between people, about the secrets families keep to protect themselves from unbearable pain. We talked about the dreams we'd both had about children who didn't exist, about the feeling of incompleteness that sometimes haunted quiet moments. That night, we held each other differently, with a new understanding that we were both shaped by losses we'd never fully comprehended. We made love with a tenderness that felt like healing, like two broken pieces finding a way to fit together perfectly. A few days later, driven by curiosity and a need to understand more about this family secret, I found myself in Ruth's room while she was at the market, looking through her belongings to help her organize them as she had requested. In the very back of her closet, behind winter coats and old dresses, I discovered a small wooden box that looked handmade. Inside were photographs of two identical babies lying side by side, tiny clothes that had been carefully preserved with lavender sachets, and a lock of the finest baby hair I'd ever seen. There were also letters, dozens of them, addressed to Simon but never sent, written in Ruth's careful handwriting over the course of 30 years. When Ruth found me with the box, instead of being angry or defensive, she looked relieved, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I've been carrying this alone for so long," she said, sitting down beside me on her bed. "It feels good to share it with someone who understands what it means to love a child." From that day forward, we talked openly about Simon, about the grief that shapes us, about the ways love can manifest as fear when we're terrified of losing what matters most. Ruth began to heal from a wound that had been festering for 30 years, and I began to understand that every difficult person carries invisible scars that explain their actions. We started a ritual of lighting a candle for Simon on his birthday, and slowly, Ruth's fear began to transform into gratitude for the family she still had. When I became pregnant again at 35, after years of trying and several heartbreaking miscarriages, Ruth was a completely different person than the controlling woman who had managed my first pregnancy. She offered advice when I asked for it, but respected my decisions about my own body and my own baby. She helped prepare for the baby's arrival without taking over, sharing her experience without imposing her will. She knitted tiny blankets and booties, but she asked what colors I preferred. She suggested names, but she didn't insist on any particular choice. When our daughter Sarah Elizabeth was born after a long and difficult labor, Ruth held her with tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect," she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. Absolutely perfect and absolutely loved. This time there was no fear, no anxiety about losing another child, no desperate need to control every aspect of the baby's care. There was only love and gratitude and wonder at the miracle of new life. Ruth had learned the difference between protective love and possessive love, and it made all the difference in the world. My sewing business continued to grow as word spread about the quality of my work and my reasonable prices. I discovered that other women in our neighborhood had stories remarkably similar to mine about domineering mothers-in-law, family secrets, and the struggle to find their own identities within traditional roles. We formed an informal network of support, gathering in each other's homes to share advice about everything from dealing with difficult relatives to managing household budgets to raising children. Ruth, with her wealth of experience and her newfound wisdom about the importance of letting go, became an unofficial advisor to many of these young women. She'd found a new purpose in helping others navigate the same treacherous waters she'd once struggled through herself. It was beautiful to watch her transform from a woman who hoarded control to one who freely shared her knowledge and support. When Sarah was 10 years old, she surprised us all by giving birth to twins, two beautiful identical girls named Emma and Grace. When Ruth saw them for the first time, lying side by side in their tiny baskets, she had a complete emotional breakdown. All the grief she'd carried for Simon came flooding back, but this time it was mixed with overwhelming joy instead of paralyzing fear. She spent hours with those babies, telling them stories about their great uncle they'd never meet, sharing love that had been locked away in her heart for decades. She would hold them both at the same time, one in each arm, and whisper to them about being grateful for each other, about never taking for granted the blessing of being born as a pair. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch her work through her grief while celebrating new life. Those twins helped Ruth finally make peace with the loss of Simon because she could see that love multiplied rather than divided when it was shared openly. Becoming a grandmother myself taught me entirely new things about Ruth and about the nature of love across generations. I watched her with my grandchildren and saw the mother she'd always wanted to be. Patient, loving, present without being controlling. The fear that had driven her behavior for so many years was finally gone, replaced by a deep appreciation for every moment with family. She'd learned that love doesn't have to be possessive to be powerful, that the best way to protect someone is to prepare them for independence. She taught Emma and Grace to sew, to cook, to tend a garden, but she also taught them to speak up for themselves, to make their own decisions, to trust their own judgment. She was determined that they would never feel the powerlessness she had felt as a young woman or the fear she had carried as a mother. On our 25th wedding anniversary, Sam and I decided to renew our vows in a ceremony that would celebrate not just our marriage, but the family we'd all learned to become together. We held the ceremony in our backyard, under the oak tree that Sam had planted the year Sarah was born. Ruth helped me choose my dress, a simple blue one that she said brought out my eyes, and as she fastened the buttons, she said something I'll never forget. "Dorothy, I want you to know that I couldn't have chosen a better wife for my son. You've made him happy in ways I never could have, and you've made me a better mother and grandmother than I ever thought possible." When Sam and I exchanged vows again, promising to love each other through whatever years remained to us, Ruth stood beside us with tears streaming down her face. We weren't just renewing our marriage, we were celebrating the family we'd all learned to become, through forgiveness, understanding, and the recognition that love comes in many forms. Years later, while cleaning out old papers in preparation for moving to a smaller house, I found a stack of letters I'd written to my mother during those first difficult years of marriage. I'd never sent them because I was too proud to admit how hard things were, too ashamed to confess that I wasn't the confident young woman I'd pretended to be. Reading them now, with the perspective of decades, I could see my own journey from a frightened teenager to a confident woman who had learned to navigate complex relationships with grace and wisdom. I could see how Ruth's challenges had actually forced me to find my own strength, to develop resilience I didn't know I possessed. Those letters helped me understand that every difficult person in our lives has something to teach us, even when the lessons are painful and the teachers are imperfect. They reminded me that growth often comes through struggle, and that the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to see past someone's actions to the pain that drives them. When Ruth reached her 80s, her health began to decline in ways that reminded us all how precious and fragile life truly is. I became her primary caregiver, helping her with daily tasks and keeping her company during the long afternoons when her energy was low. Instead of feeling burdened by this responsibility, I felt honored to be able to give back to the woman who had given me so much, even when her gifts had been wrapped in difficulty. This woman who had once seemed like my enemy had become one of my dearest friends, and I treasured every conversation we had during those final years. We spent hours talking about her childhood in rural Tennessee, her courtship with Harold, her dreams for Sam's future, and her hopes for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren she'd lived to see grow up. She told me stories I'd never heard before, shared wisdom about marriage and motherhood that only comes from lived experience, and helped me understand that every family carries both joy and sorrow, and that our job is to honor both. Ruth passed away quietly in her sleep on a beautiful spring morning, surrounded by the family she'd protected and loved in her own complicated way. At her funeral, person after person stood up to talk about how Ruth had helped them through difficult times, how she'd offered practical advice and emotional support when they needed it most. I realized that the controlling woman I'd once feared had spent her later years giving back to her community in ways I'd never fully understood or appreciated. She'd left us not just her material possessions, but her strength, her resilience, her hard-won wisdom about the importance of family, and most importantly, her example of how people can change and grow even in their final years. She taught us all that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, and that love, even difficult love, is always worth the effort it takes to understand and accept it. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story has touched your heart and reminded you that even the most difficult relationships can be transformed by patience, understanding, and love. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It really helps us reach more people who might need to hear these messages. Every day we share new stories about life, love, family, and the lessons we learn along the way. I'd love to know what you thought of this story and whether it reminded you of any relationships in your own life. Please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me such joy to know that these stories are reaching people all around the world. Until tomorrow, remember that every difficult person in your life has a story that explains their actions, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give is the gift of understanding. See you next time.